how to break the cycle of imposter syndrome. If you remember just one thing from this video, it's think differently about it. Think differently about imposter syndrome. So there's three things we're going to talk about today. Number one is to tell yourself a better story. Number two is to acknowledge what went well. And number three is to redefine what an expert means. Let's go through those three things. So first of all, I want you to look on the slide here at this imposter syndrome cycle of doom, very sophisticated diagram that I created, and you can see our imposter syndrome skeleton guy in the middle there going, oh no, I've got imposter syndrome. So you start at the top and you think about a task that you want to do, a task that you have to do in your career, your everyday life, something in your personal life that brings on imposter syndrome feelings. And then you go around clockwise to overthink. That's the first step where imposter syndrome starts to warm up and gather strength. We start to overthink it and we start to tell ourselves a negative story here. It's a bad interpretation of what has actually happened. It's a one-sided story. It's just a perspective that's just one-sided. We start to say, what is happening, what could have happened, and, we overthink it. Then we start to doubt ourselves. And we ask ourselves, was I good enough? Am I good enough? And the negative self-talk starts to enter our mind. Then the mental looping begins. The same thoughts go around and round in your head, and you try to find where you went wrong, and you try to fix it inside your head. And then the anxiety can build up. Then you withdraw. You don't ask for help. You don't get an outside opinion, a second opinion, which would be really helpful at that point. Then depression and self-pity can kick in. We might want to give up at this point, procrastinate. We keep going around to the end there and we reinforce our own negative story. We say, see, I told myself, I'm right. I'm an imposter because of all of these things. So this is like cognitive bias 101. We say to ourselves, I believe I'm an imposter, and we go and look for evidence to back up our belief. So that's the imposter syndrome cycle of doom. So how do we break out of that cycle? Number one, we tell ourselves a better story. Now we look at this next slide. This is the happy face imposter syndrome cycle breaking sophisticated diagram. So the first thing you want to do when you're thinking about a task that you've got to do, or you might be doing the task and imposter syndrome feelings come up, okay? Go to that place right now. Now, instead of overthinking, like we did in the previous slide, instead of overthinking, you're going to think differently. That's all. You're going to think of a better story to tell yourself. You're going to interpret what is going on in a positive light. And this leads us to the second point, which is to acknowledge what could go right. Acknowledge what is going right when you're doing the task. And then after you've finished the task, acknowledge what did go well. That's the second step. Then the last step, or the last point, is to redefine what an expert means to you. And I like to redefine an expert as the eternal student. This way, I'm humble and I allow myself to make mistakes. And I acknowledge that an expert enjoys learning about themselves and their craft, their field, their skill, whatever it is. And they never feel that they're an expert. They always enjoy being a student. And that way, imposter syndrome cannot touch you because you say, well, I consider myself a student, not so much an expert. This way, you can break out of the imposter syndrome cycle. So, in summary, if you want to break the cycle of imposter syndrome, think differently about it. And you can do that in three ways. You can tell yourself a better story. You can acknowledge what went well or what could go well. And the third thing is to redefine what it means to be an expert. And that is how you break the cycle of imposter syndrome.